Today we're going to dive into the mind of Steve Jobs and some of the questions that he asked to see if they could be useful for us. Now, many of us know Steve Jobs for his work at Apple Computers, but he obviously was involved in some other projects along the way as well. And he was known to ask certain questions over and over again. And so I spent time going back and listening to some interviews with Steve Jobs, some of his speeches and presentations and other things like that. I've tried to narrow it down to a series of questions. Certainly there are lots of different questions, and the words that I use here in this video are not precisely the word that Steve uses all the time, but they get to the spirit of the questions that he asks. So I've broken it into three broad categories and three main questions that we'll dive into. And these have some pretty incredible implications. So stay with me and we're going to dive into this together. So the first one is the existence check. Why does this exist? What problem does this actually solve? And this is a question that I know people who are involved in product development and other things around wonder about, but it can lead you down all sorts of interesting paths. If you go into an organization and there's a policy or there's a rule or something else that's there, and you ask this question, well, why does this policy actually exist? What problem is this policy actually trying to solve? And sometimes you even have to dive into the history and find out about where it came from and why it emerged. And it can lead you on some fascinating and often baffling journeys when you take the time to ask that question and to follow it to a meaningful and actual answer. And it gives you incredible insight. In fact, as a person who's been a teacher over the years, I used to teach college students and graduate students, and I would give them an assignment where they would have to go and do a study of the history of the technology practices in a school. And why do they have their policies that they have? What's the history of the things that they've done in the past? And you can begin to see some really interesting things that give you insight, that allow you to see things differently than you would have otherwise. And of course, Steve Jobs used this question to really challenge the relevance of certain things. Why is this thing around? It also allows you to get into the mind of the user of something that you're trying to build or you're designing. So it can be useful in a lot of different ways. The second question then is the essence check. What is the single essential core of this idea or this thing, whatever it is? Where is the part that must be really great? What is the essence of it? Now, I don't want to get too philosophical on you, but I'm going to give you a simple example here that even comes from philosophy that can be useful for all of us in our everyday life. So imagine that I ask you the question, what is the essence of a ball? What are the traits that are so fundamental that if you took them away, it would cease to be a ball? And someone might say to me, it has to be round. And I would say, what about a football? Is it round? Well, on one plane, it's round. So maybe a ball has to be round on at least one plane. So you go to this kind of dialogue with a person about something, and eventually you come to understand what are the elements of something that are essential. They actually have to be there or it's no longer that thing. And then you can also notice that there are some attributes that are important, that it can still be that, but it changes its function quite a bit if you change these things. And then you can get to this category of thing that we might just say it's merely present. Like these are features that it doesn't really matter whether they're or not. It doesn't impact the function or the use or anything else much. It's not really that essential to it. And it might seem like an interesting exercise, but if you do that about different things in your life, different things that we're navigating in our life, we can find that we're able to think much more clearly about ideas. And when we know what's essential about something, we can be better at avoiding making really bad mistakes. I sometimes talk about this also, even when you're dealing with organizations or communities or a group of friends. I talk about the idea of load-bearing walls. So a house has some walls that are really decorative, or they have a sort of a functional use to separate one room from another, but you could actually take that wall out and it wouldn't hurt the house in any way. It's just there, and that's fine. But there are some walls that are load bearing, And that is really important to know, because if you just knock that wall out, it could actually impact the structural integrity of the entire building. The roof could fall on you in a worst case scenario. So you need to know which walls are essential to the structure and which are not before you go tearing things down and remodeling. That's part of why it's important to ask this question. And Steve Jobs asked that question about their product development and the like as well. What's really at the heart of it? Let's get to the heart of it, make sure that we don't lose that and we keep that, and it's critical. And then he, of course, asked this question, if it's essential, how do we make it insanely great? How do we make those essential elements incredible? And the other stuff, we can consider that later. The third question then is the exclusion question. What are we saying no to? The reality is a lot of things would be so much better if they were simpler. I love this word elegant. There are a lot of things in our lives that we just overcomplicate. We overcomplicate decisions, we overcomplicate a lot of things. And the question of what are we saying no to, or what happens if we remove this, allows you to simplify something, and there's something really beautiful about that. And I think Apple computers had been known for doing that with their products for a long time. Certainly, there are many and varied features, but really getting to something that's elegantly simple, but those few things that it does incredibly well, so much so that people are really satisfied and really happy with it. And that is a great question for us to ask in our lives. Think about this and how this can be used even in, maybe it's your own health practices, your own exercise practices. I'm known, for example, I like to experiment with different supplements and exercises and other things like that, but more is not necessarily better. Sometimes less is more. And what if I narrow down and I figure out that if I do these specific exercises and I eat these few key things, maybe there are only 6, 7, 8 core things that I need to do consistently, and they're going to give me 90% of the results. That's where these questions can lead you. And that's why I'm a big fan of these Steve Jobs questions.